Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm the manager of Project Jumpstart. And thank you all for coming today, and especially thank you to Dr. Brad Stepp for being here and spending his time to talk about this very important issue. I know a lot of people cannot be here today, so we are recording the session, but just to let you know, it is being recorded in speaker view. So if you don't unmute your microphone, you won't be seen on the recording. And if you have any questions, you can just put them in the chat and I'll interrupt Brad whenever there's a convenient time and read your question without revealing your name. So just letting you know there's a confidentiality guarantee here. Also, if you don't feel comfortable putting your question in the chat in front of everyone, because I know I sometimes feel weird asking questions in front of so many people, you can just directly message me in the Zoom chat and I will again read your question without revealing your name. So let me quickly introduce Brad to you for those of you that don't know him. Dr. Brad Stepp has been working as a psychologist at IU for the past 10 years, and he's been the dedicated CAPS counselor at Jacobs for the past 5 years. And CAPS, of course, is IU Counseling and Psychological Services, which exists to support students in our mental health and well-being. Dr. Stepp completed his graduate studies at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and clinical training at Stanford University. And he's worked with students dealing with a variety of issues, including anxiety, depression, relationship concerns, and identity issues. And one thing that we should all know as students is that the first 2 counseling sessions we get through CAPS are completely free for us. So it's a really great way to just talk to someone and get started on your mental health journey. And if you want to do that, you can call the number that's listed in the handout and just directly ask to be connected to the Jacobs counselor. Okay, so again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat at any time throughout the session. I'll read them out loud, keeping your name confidential. And with that said, maybe Brad, you want to get started?
Sure, let's just jump right in. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. Can you all see that?
That's good.
Yep, okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So when talking about, before we get started actually, when talking about the ways to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic, the anxiety that can result from that, it's going to be important to talk a bit about adaptive anxiety and what we mean by that term. So the anxiety symptoms that you're most likely feeling from the COVID-19 pandemic are valid and a normal response to such a stressful situation. So feeling scared, the fear of the unknown, feeling out of control, that's entirely normal and is a sentiment shared by a lot of people right now. The problem with that is that intense and chronic anxiety can also lead to harmful effects on your body and your mind. So that includes an increase in pain, fatigue, increased inflammation, and then of course, psychological effects with that. So for a lot of people, the uncertainty of what's going to happen and the sense of a lack of control we have surrounding the pandemic is probably the most difficult part to manage. So there are a lot of things changing. Things change day to day, but things have been changing lately hour by hour, the information that we get about the pandemic. And most of us are not sure how this is going to impact our near futures, but also our long-term futures. So people who are wanting to go to grad school or audition for jobs, it's up in the air how all of that is going to work. So some of the thoughts people have been having, or at least the people we've been working with at the health center, so how bad will it actually get? What will next fall look like? How long is this going to be happening? Will X, Y, or Z get canceled or be impacted? So with all of these questions, it becomes really easy to have a snowball effect with the anxiety. We start to catastrophize and spiral out of control, really, with a sense of dread or panic about what's going to happen. And so that's what this presentation is about, how to deal with that. So there are some journal questions throughout the presentation. So if you could take just a couple moments to reflect on these questions. So the first question is, what type of what if thoughts have you had with the COVID pandemic? And when your anxiety related to the current pandemic is at an all-time high, what's going on? What types of thoughts are you having? So we'll take a minute to give some thought to those questions. And if you can type these out or write these down, that's probably going to be a good idea so that you can reference them later. Okay. So it's important to understand about the physiological reaction to anxiety. And when we talk about that, we have to talk about the fight or flight or freeze response. Now, a lot of you probably have heard about that. So essentially, the most primitive part of our brain, the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that elicits emotions, it's developed an evolutionary instinct to protect us from danger. So it's what's kept our ancestors safe from threats. Another way to think about it is our amygdala is the anxiety switch in the brain that is turned on and off. So it helps protect us, and it goes into fight or flight mode. And then that allows us to avoid the scary thing. The problem with that is it can't really tell between perceived dangers and actual dangers. So here's some of the physiological examples that the fight or flight can elicit. So oftentimes people describe it as your thoughts are racing, you feel dizzy or lightheaded, you start breathing more shallowly, your heart beats faster, your hands get clammy and sweaty, your muscles tense up, so you're ready to fight or you're ready to flee. So because the amygdala, which again is the anxiety on-off switch, because it's often mistriggered, it can be tough to distinguish what's an actual threat and what's a perceived threat. So given the current COVID pandemic, a lot of our nervous systems are in constant overdrive, responding to what if or worst case scenarios. So every time you turn on the news or go online, you see COVID stories usually, and they're usually not very pretty stories either. So what have you done to try and control your anxiety so far? And how does that control strategy help you in the short term and then help you in the long term? So if you want to take a moment to give those two questions some thoughts. So now to the bread and butter of the presentation, the strategies you can use to help deal with all of this anxiety that I've talked about on the previous slides. So the first tip is to control what you can control. So you can control how you spend your time. You can control how you're thinking about the pandemic, your perspective and attitude. You can also, to a large extent, control how you keep yourself safe. And you can control what you can do for self-care. And we can also control our planning for the future. And we'll talk more about planning for the future in a bit. The second tip is to be very mindful of the media consumption. So while of course it's important to stay up to date with what's going on with the pandemic, there can be too much of a good thing, I guess. So actual media and social media platforms, of course, have become saturated with information regarding the pandemic. So people who are constantly monitoring that can feel a huge sense of anxiety, because there's a lot of panic and misinformation out there, and that only feeds into the fear response. So then we start to see conflicting information, and then we start doubting our sources, and it can lead to an anxiety spiral. So what has been the relationship between your anxiety and the media coverage of the pandemic? And what sources are important for you to get your information about the pandemic from? And then the other part of the question, what sources could you limit, and should you probably limit as we move through the pandemic? I know for myself, I had to turn off the news alerts on my phone because it was getting to be too much to be bombarded with information repeatedly throughout the day. So speaking of that, it's a good idea to find 2 or 3 trustworthy sources. So the World Health Organization or the CDC or the local health department from whom you can receive accurate information. And it's a good idea to limit exposure to other media outlets outside of those few sources. Limiting how often you check for COVID updates is also really important, and this is going to be different for everybody. So some people like to check for 5 minutes a few times a day what's going on. Other people like to do 2 larger chunks, one in the morning and one in the evening. Whatever you do, don't do it before you go to bed, because that can make it more difficult to sleep if you're reading about very stressful information. It's a good idea to figure out what your limit is and to recognize when it's time to step away from looking at the information. Some people have a information buddy, so to speak, and they ask someone reliable to share any important updates with them. So that can be a good idea as well. The third tip is to focus on what is certain. So what is the known? So like I was saying before, the unknown of the pandemic is the biggest anxiety producer. Again, some of those questions that we probably have all asked ourselves are, how long is this going to last? Is this going to impact me personally? Am I going to get infected? Are family members going to? How is this going to change our day-to-day life moving forward? All of this uncertainty just fuels the anxiety. So grounding ourselves to what is certain, even if the certainty is teeny tiny, it can help us change our perspective of how we're viewing the pandemic. It can also counteract some of the negative experiences, such as catastrophizing and having that snowball effect with the anxiety. So it is completely natural to be concerned about what may happen or what may not happen. And there is a way that we can be proactive and certain of what we can control to help decrease the anxiety. So writing down specific worries that we have can be helpful. Making a list of all possible solutions to those specific worries is what's going to counteract the anxiety. So include any possible solutions that come to mind. And it's important not to get caught up in, well, it's not the perfect solution. That's not the point here. It's just identifying some solutions. Focusing on concrete things that can be problem solved is important. And after you've evaluated the options above, it's a good idea to develop an action plan. So these are immediate steps that you can take to remind yourself that you've done everything that you can do in your power at the moment. So it's letting go of things we can't control and only focusing on what we can. Changing our what if thoughts to even if thoughts is really important. So those are the worst case scenario thoughts. So an example would be, even if there's another lockdown order, I know that I'll be able to complete my work. Or even if there continues to be outbreaks in Bloomington, I know that there's a system in place that's going to help mitigate some of those effects from the outbreak. So again, if the worst case scenario actually happens, what are you going to do? Another example would be, if I lose my job, what am I going to do? Well, I would apply for unemployment. I'll ask my family for help. I'll move back in with my family. And then as you're doing this exercise, changing the what ifs to even ifs, reminding yourself what is certain right now is going to be really important. So I am certain that I can get my work done, or I am certain that I love my family and want to help keep them safe, or I am certain that I am able to practice every week and meet with my teacher, even if it's through Zoom. So again, this is a way to ground yourself to the present moment. So try and answer some of your worst case scenario thoughts right now. Even if they happen, what are you going to do about them? And then what are the things that you have certainty over at the moment? So we'll take a moment to reflect on those questions. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So the fourth tip is to practice gratitude. So what we're finding out in the field of psychology, and there have been studies about this over the past few years, especially, is that gratitude is strongly associated with happiness. And the expression of thankfulness for a person, event, situation, or activity can elicit positive emotional effects. It can also help in building our long-term relationships and improving our ability to deal with stressful situations. So utilizing a gratitude journal, listing what things you're grateful for on a daily basis, can actually decrease stress, improve our sleep, and increase our insight and awareness. So when we express gratitude, our brain releases two neurotransmitters, two chemicals that are responsible for the feel-good emotions. You've probably seen these chemicals talked about in medication commercials, dopamine and serotonin. So gratitude regulates the sympathetic nervous system that activates our body's anxiety responses. So going back to the fight or flight discussion, practicing gratitude is one way to counteract some of the negative effects of the fight or flight response. It's important to keep in mind that gratitude is not necessarily meant to discount or invalidate our difficult thoughts or emotions. They're a way to cope with them. So being scared, being afraid is completely normal and valid, especially in a global pandemic. So continuing to grieve the loss of the life that we had pre-COVID is completely normal. It's just when the grieving and the thinking starts to elicit a lot of anxiety, that's when things get a bit tricky. So what are 5 big or small things that happened today that you are grateful for? And then give some thought to how you can practice gratitude more regularly, preferably on a daily basis. And then just a reminder that if you want to, if you have questions for me to answer, you can send those in the chat feature. So I'll save some time at the end for questions. All right, moving on. So the 5th tip is to practice self-care. And being the Jacobs counselor for the past 5 years, I can say with certainty that this is where some students struggle, many students struggle. Self-care can offer us ways that we can create more consistency, routine, and reduce chronic stress. It also helps ground us. Anything that you've tried before that's helped you feel less stressed and more grounded, like yoga or deep breathing or meditation, mindfulness, accurate nutrition, exercise, it's important to bring those things back now more than ever. And will you need to likely be more creative with your self-care? Absolutely. Because a lot of people's self-care involves socializing with each other. And of course, we have to be careful with that during the pandemic. Again, as a Jacobs counselor, I want to emphasize that being kind to yourself, being compassionate with yourself is extremely, extremely important. So if you start to feel more anxious or if you're having a bad day, that's okay. It's not helpful to beat yourself up for that. One thing I tell people to do who have trouble with being kind to themselves is to talk to themselves the way they would talk to a friend. So if a friend was experiencing that exact situation, what would you tell them? And many times people would say, well, I would tell them this or that. Well, there's a double standard there probably between how you treat yourself and how you treat other people. Making adjustments to your daily routine and attempting to stick to a routine is going to be important as well. Definitely include the activities that you find most enjoyable. So it's not necessarily the specific activity that's important. It's the sense of joy and calmness that the activity could elicit that's going to be the most important thing. Getting out in nature can also be helpful. So going for a walk or sitting outside. And make it a point to connect with at least 2 people every day. And it's a good idea if it's more than just a text message or an email. If possible, it's good to just chat with someone over the phone for a few minutes or FaceTime them or set up a Zoom meeting and chat for a few minutes. There are lots of platforms where you can watch movies together. That's a good idea. So let's take a moment or two for you to think of ways in which you can practice and maintain self-care and what adjustments you should make to your current schedule to accommodate your needs, especially if you've noticed that there's not as much self-care in your daily routine. All right. So how are you supposed to determine if you may need additional help beyond what we've talked about today. So there are several things you can watch out for. Increase in any other symptoms, such as depressive symptoms, trouble getting out of bed, trouble sleeping, severe increase in anxiety, changes in appetite or hygiene. So if you're not able to shower or do your laundry, reduced functioning in your job or in your academics. So not going to class or not being able to fulfill your job duties. Of course, thoughts of suicide or self-harm or harm to others is a big indication that you probably need to meet with one of the counselors at CAPS or myself as the Jacobs counselor so that we can get you connected with more resources. So I wanted to mention our services. So at CAPS, we provide individual and group counseling. Again, I'm the Jacobs counselor, so for 20 hours a week, I work exclusively with Jacobs students. Pre-COVID, my office was in Merrill Hall, but we're offering all of our services remotely through video this semester. So this is an important phone number. It's our phone number, 812-855-5711. That's the number that you call to make an appointment. That's also the number you call if you're experiencing a mental health crisis. So there's always a counselor available 24/7. We also have sexual assault counseling, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then we offer lots of free workshops. So if you go to our webpage, just Google IU Counseling and Psychological Services, and you'll be able to see a list of workshops that we're offering. And a lot of the workshops are recorded, so you would be able to watch recordings of those as well. So there's lots of information on our website. So we have free counseling services available for anyone who's experienced a sexual assault. SACS is an extension of CAPS, but these are specific counselors that are trained in trauma work and in working with people who've experienced sexual violence. So these services include individual and group counseling, support groups, psychiatric care, and we also can direct students to judicial or legal resources. And we have a separate phone number for people who have experienced sexual assault or sexual violence, and that number is 812-855-8900. You could also call the CAPS number. We would be able to transfer you there as well. So SAC services are available for all genders and identities. Okay, that's the end of the PowerPoint. And so now we'll open it up to questions or comments.
So again, if anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll just read them out, keeping your name confidential. Brad, thank you so much for this presentation.
Absolutely.
I actually have one question. What are
Sure.
some other certainties or like some examples of certainties that you can hold on to keep yourself grounded when you get stressed or anxious?
Mm-hmm. Those would be specific goals that you have for the week or the month, things you're working on with your teacher and practicing sessions, lessons, relationships that you know you can depend on is another important thing that you can remind yourself that you feel certain about. You have resources at the university, including CAPS, that can help you deal with stressful situations or any symptoms you're experiencing related to the pandemic. Let's see, what would be some others? Short-term goals, I think I mentioned that before, is going to be really important because that's going to do two things. One, it's going to keep you organized and grounded, and it's also something that you can check off a list, and that can be really helpful too.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Do you have any off-campus services or places you recommend for anxiety in addition to what IU provides through CAPS?
Mm-hmm. So there is the WellTrack app that I believe you put that in the handout that you sent in the chat feature. So that's a good resource. We also can provide you with referrals if you would rather see a therapist in the community. And a lot of students would rather do that because they may want longer term treatment. And so you would be able to come to us and we could connect you with an outside therapist as well. And then there are lots of online support groups for COVID. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any tips for motivation and balancing productivity with self-care?
Motivation and balancing productivity with
This is tricky for
self-care.
students.
This is very tricky for students, yes. I think you could start with doing a self-inventory of what things are important to you right now. And that list is that you could prioritize that list, and maybe at the moment your number one priority is self-care. And so maybe your don't tell your teachers I said this, but maybe your practicing or schoolwork could take a back seat for a week or two. And then for some people that may be flipped. Maybe they've been engaging in self-care and doing a great job of that. So then their number one priority should be getting back into the swing of things with their practicing or schoolwork. Having a friend that you check in with also can be helpful. So you can have an accountability buddy. So you can hold each other accountable for goals that you tell the other that you have for the next week. That can be really helpful. I know some students who are roommates who are doing that. So when your accountability buddy lives in the same place as you do, you can't really slack off.
They're keeping track of you.
They're keeping track, exactly.
So is it then a lot about just staying in tune with yourself and like being really aware of what you need that week or that moment?
Yes,
Okay.
because it's most likely going to change week to week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm having some students who are coming in talking about auditioning for graduate school in December and January and what that's going to look like and what's the job market going to look like. And so part of what we do in counseling is those things are important and we certainly can talk about them, but what is important right now? What do you need to do over the next week or 2 weeks or month? And then we'll deal with the other stuff when it rolls around.
Do you have any suggestions on how to encourage and support friends who are extremely anxious or have chronic anxiety? And maybe also those that are afraid to gather in person?
Uh-huh. So you can refer them to me or to CAPS. So that would be one option, get them connected to a therapist. And let me just remind people again that if you're a student and you're taking over, I think it's 6 credit hours, you've automatically paid the health fee that's included in your student fees. And so that entitles you to 2 free counseling visits every semester. And then you're also seen beyond that at a reduced rate. And we also have resources for students who can't afford therapy also. So some students pay nothing. So that would be an option. Another option would be to ask the friend what would be most helpful for them. Do they want you to check in with them every few days? Do they want to do an activity online, like watch a movie together? Do they want to talk on the phone? And then that'll give them a sense of control of what they feel like would be best for them. And then if they say, well, I don't really want to talk about it, then you could change the subject and focus on something else.
So a lot about just staying engaged with them in any way.
Staying connected and engaged, yeah. And don't be afraid if you start to notice that maybe their functioning is being impacted. It's okay to point that out to them and express your concern. Hey, I've noticed that we haven't hung out in a while, and you canceled on our last few plans, and I remember you saying it was difficult for you to go to class. What's going on? How are you feeling? So yeah. It can be hard though when we are seeing our friends and family struggle and feeling like we can't really help them.
Do you have any tips for when you have a friend that's dealing with that, like how you can balance supporting them and also not becoming emotionally dragged down with that, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. So before you, it's kind of like the announcement they have on airplanes. You need to secure your own mask before you can help someone else. So the same thing applies to psychological well-being. So we have to feel like we're taking care of ourselves first before we could offer assistance to other people. So know what your boundaries are. When you start to notice that you're feeling more stressed out, or you're experiencing other difficulties when you're thinking about this friend or interacting with them, then it may be time to reevaluate the situation and what's going on. And that could be an instance where, okay, this is outside of my scope. I think the person needs to see a counselor. And so you may want to frame it differently to your friend, but referring them to a counselor is a good idea. Other questions? I'd really encourage you to keep handy some of those journal questions, or if you weren't able to write them down, you can view them again in the recording, so that you're going to have access to some of those prompts that will allow you to focus more on the present moment than having your mind wander in the future and getting really stressed out by that.
Yeah, those are really helpful. If there are no more questions, then I guess we can give Brad a big virtual round of applause and say thank you so much for being here, for preparing your presentation, and for taking the time to show us so calmly and gently all these strategies for dealing with anxiety and stress.
Yeah, my pleasure. And if you have any questions, you can always leave me a message, and I can give you a call back.
Oh, okay. So to reach you, do they just call that number that's on the handout?
Yes, they just call the 5711 number, and I'll get back to you.
Okay. Sounds good. Alrighty then. Thank you everyone for coming, and for those of you also who were promoting this to your student organizations. I know I sent out like an email asking for some help with that. And once we have the recording up, I'll be sure to email everyone that attended, and you can have access to that as well as the handout that I posted in the chat today. Alrighty. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Remember to wash your hands and wear your mask. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.